Welcome to our confirmation review this week. We're going to be talking about the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. And so tonight, we're going to be talking about it in three ways. First, we're going to hear about the story of David and Bathsheba and how not following this commandment led to some really awful consequences. Second, we're going to talk about what it means not to commit adultery and how we are called to help others be faithful as well. And third, we're going to talk about the commandment not to commit adultery and how it helps us change the world by modeling faithfulness and loyalty to the world. So, let's get started. So we've met King David before, back when we talked about David and his Psalms that he wrote, when we talked about the third commandment, about the Sabbath. Now, David was really important, a very important person in Israel's history. So this story is about him and a woman named Bathsheba, and about how the king did this kind of damage that sin can do in the world. You see, at the time, David's armies were off fighting a war with one of the countries around Israel. And David was usually a warrior-type king. He would be with the army, but he was getting older, and this particular campaign season, he decided to stay in Jerusalem instead of joining the army. Well, when he was in Jerusalem, there wasn't a whole lot to do, so he spent a lot of time wandering around the palace. Well, one evening, he happened to spot this beautiful woman on a roof nearby. Now, one of the things about being king, especially in David's day, was that you had a lot of power to do pretty much whatever you wanted. But when he saw this woman on the roof, he immediately wanted her. So he called on his servants to bring them up to him. Now, this woman, Bathsheba, was put in kind of an impossible position because she didn't really have a choice to say no whether or not she wanted to go to David. So she came with David's servants, and David dazzled her as the king, and he ended up sleeping with her. Now, this was already bad, but it got worse. See, it's bad enough that David wasn't married to Bathsheba, and in fact, David was already married to another woman. But on top of that, Bathsheba was married to one of David's most loyal soldiers, a guy named Uriah, who was off fighting in that very war that David decided not to go to. So David, a married man, slept with Bathsheba, a married woman, breaking all kinds of vows. Then to top it all off, a little while later, he found out that Bathsheba was pregnant, and he is the only person who could be the father. So David, even though as king he can do pretty much whatever he wants, he also doesn't want Uriah to find out what he has done. So David came up with a plan. He sent a letter to the war, calling Uriah back home to Jerusalem, and there was a welcome party that Uriah got to celebrate with David. And David urged Uriah after the party to go home to his wife. That way, he could claim that Uriah was really the father of this child, not David. The only problem was that Uriah was a really good and loyal soldier, loyal to his fellow soldiers, who decided not to go home because his fellow soldiers couldn't go home to their wives. David had to come up with another plan. So Uriah was sent back to the war the next day, along with a letter to his commander. The letter was written by King David, ordering the commander to put Uriah in a dangerous place in the battle and make sure that he didn't come home. It was definitely not David's finest moment. And in fact, the commander did end up following the orders. Uriah was put too close to the walls of the city they were besieging, and he was killed. Because of that one sin of David deciding that he wanted Bathsheba, he ended up committing even greater sin by having Uriah killed. If he had just been faithful and recognized the need to honor Uriah and Bathsheba's faithfulness to each other, all of this could have been avoided. But David broke the commandment not to commit adultery, and because of it, he caused all kinds of more suffering. So this is the sixth commandment. You shall not commit adultery. Now, adultery is not a word that we hear very often, and I imagine that you don't hear it very often outside of church if you hear it at all. But the easiest way to think of it is as a kind of synonym for cheating on someone else. It's more than that, but essentially, adultery is when you are cheating on someone. But like all the other commandments that we will be looking at, following this commandment is about more than just not cheating on someone. It's also a commandment about being faithful. See, God gave us the gift of sex to express love to another person on an entirely different level. It's a way that two people can share each other's whole selves. It's deeply intimate and it's deeply holy. But that kind of expression of love, like most expressions of love, can also be dangerous when it is misused. When we treat sex lightly, like it's no big deal to sleep around or something like that, it can cause a lot of deep hurt. That's why God gave us the gift of marriage, as a kind of safe place where we can have the kind of deep vulnerability and whole self-sharing that sex is. And marriage is built around promises of faithfulness and loyalty, so that that kind of space of trust can be made between two people. Adultery is when that trust, that kind of vulnerability that it needs, is broken. When one person breaks those promises that they made, it's a harm that is more than just lying. It's violating the truly sacred space that two people have shared only with each other. Adultery is on the list of the Ten Commandments because making sure marriage is a space where both people can open up their whole selves and love each other fully is important to God. Marriage is supposed to not just be a place where two people can share that kind of faithfulness with one another, but also an example to the world of what that faithfulness is supposed to look like. We can read this commandment as applying to more than just sex and marriage, though. Martin Luther put the commandment this way: "We are to fear and love God, so that we lead pure and decent lives in word and deed, and each of us loves and honors his or her spouse." This commandment is about faithfulness, being true to your word and keeping your promises, or leading pure and decent lives, as Martin Luther said. You can show that kind of faithfulness to other people in your life as well, not just in marriage. People know that you are a good friend when you do what you say you'll do, or when you keep promises that you make. When you're loyal, you inspire trust in others, that they will trust in you. When you take your promises seriously, when you are true to your word, you are fulfilling this commandment. And on the flip side, this commandment means helping others keep their promises. It can be really tempting to break our promises sometimes, or to go back on our word. But by helping others keep their commitments, you are fulfilling the commandment. That means encouraging your friend to follow through on a promise, or helping someone do what they said that they'll do, especially when it's hard for them. It doesn't have to be huge, heroic things all the time either. Reminding your sibling to set their alarms so they wake up for work on time is helping them keep their promise to be on time for things. And so is convincing a friend not to mess around behind their girlfriend or boyfriend's back. All of these things are ways that we can help people build faithfulness in their lives and fulfill the commandment. So how does this affect the real world? The thing about faithfulness and loyalty is that it doesn't get to be centered on you. One of the hardest parts about following the commandment is that everything in television, on the internet, and everywhere else in the world just about keeps insisting that it needs to be about you. But it's not just about you. This commandment is a reminder to look outside of yourself. And if more people did that, why would the world change? Think of the contrast between David and Uriah. David wasn't faithful or trustworthy because he not only cheated by sleeping with Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, but he worked so hard to cover up his sin that he ended up having a man killed. Compare that to Uriah, who was so loyal to his fellow soldiers that he wouldn't even go home to his wife because he knew his fellow soldiers couldn't do the same. The difference between them was their commitment to faithfulness and loyalty. We follow this commandment, to be faithful and loyal, so that the world can see what it looks like to care about something outside of yourself, like Uriah cared for his fellow soldiers. Being faithful to your word goes against the grain of only doing what's good for you, and shifts the focus to whether things are good for your neighbor or not. Think of the other commandments that we have looked at. Faithfulness to others makes not stealing and not killing and their positive flip sides a lot easier to follow. And by being faithful and showing others that you're faithful, they will be more willing to trust in you. And the thing about trust is that it is more valuable than anything else. When people truly trust you, they become willing to help you, to be helped by you, to listen to you. If we all took the commandments seriously to be faithful and loyal to others, we would be far more willing to trust each other. And if we trusted each other, we would be much more willing to work together to make the world a better place, without constantly worrying that someone was just in it for themselves, ready to drop us at a moment's notice. Being faithful and loyal lays the foundation for doing all of the things that God calls on us to do. So to review, we talked about the story of David and Bathsheba and how not following this commandment has really awful consequences. We learned about what it means to commit adultery and how we are called to help others be faithful as well. And we learned that the commandment not to commit adultery means that we change the world by modeling faithfulness and loyalty to the whole world. And that is the sixth commandment.